Hello students, today we'll be talking about the two scholars, the remaining two, that is Robert King Martin and George Herbert Mead. Let me begin with this, that when you read Parsons, try to take some time to read Martin simultaneously. Because when you are looking at the Martinian methodological concerns, somehow or other we will be finding about Martin having certain reservations toward the ground theorizing what Parsons has initiated. The requisite functionalism, what was initiated by Parsons, we will be finding about deviation in a Martinian sociology. And thus, somewhere, in terms of the methodological concerns, what we talked about in terms of Parsons, the search of a ground theory or mega theory, we will be finding about the concept of MRT or MRTs rather, that is middle range theories, with which a new methodological tool would be introduced in a sociological tradition. Thus, if you are talking about Martin, then let's begin. Martin has been empiricist. So we will be talking about methodological concerns. And thus in the methodological concerns, the critical appraisal of Parsonian grand scale theorizing. And from here, Martin will also be talking about the crisis in sociological tradition. And once he talks about the crisis in sociological tradition, then we will be finding about the relationship between theory and research. In terms of the relations between theory and research, we will be having the formulation of MRTs, that is middle range and the best way to understand middle range theory in one line is fill in the blanks with any empirical category. And we'll also be looking at the refinement of functionalism and how, with the work of deviance, Martin will establish as a serious scholar for once and all. So when you're looking at the themes which are there in the syllabus, we'll be finding about concept of functionalism. When you're talking about the concept of functionalism, Martin will recognize the contribution of both the anthropological and the sociological traditions. Both these traditions would be analyzed by Martin in developing his theory, developing his understanding in functionalism. And in this attempt, Merton will refine and modify the classical functionalism. Merton will also be looking at the certain functional postulates. It means here refinement and modification of classical functionalism, in which we will also be looking at postulates of functional analysis, that is unity, universality and indispensability. With the concept of this, we will be basically talking about the notion of the functional alternative or substitutes. He will also be talking about manifest and latent function. This analysis of latent and function will also be related to Merton's view on serendipity. So this is overall perspective within which Mertonian functionalism would be going on. And once you have done it, a protocol for the functional analysis would be provided by a Merton. And with this protocol of functional analysis, Merton will basically be refining and modifying the classical functionalist analysis. Once you have done it, then you have to talk about sociology of deviance. The maximum quotient is coming from there. In terms of anomy, in terms of social structure producing strain resulting into anomy. So here we will be talking about social structure, deviance and concept of anomy. Conceptual clarity is there. And then the reference group. However, we will talk about the reference group, the two other concepts in the analysis of reference group has to be talked about. That is basically relative deprivation and anticipatory socialization. And then from there you talk about the criticism. I am not giving the works of the critics because that maybe I'm thinking that if some new ones comes out, you do not have to read something new at this sort of span of time. And this way the Mertonian sociological understanding has to be developed. Robert King Merton, an American sociologist, particularly in the post-World War II scenario, will initiate a new insight into the structural functionalism. And more precisely in American sociological tradition. No denying the fact that in the post-World War II scenario, Merton along with the Parsons became famous for the structural functions analysis. But just as the Parson was basically developing his concept of functional requisite, Merton moves away from there. And Merton initiates a newer kind of analysis, moving away from Parsonian functional prerequisite. Just as Parsons was trying to develop the grand theory in sociology, Merton takes a different stand. And he initiates a critique to Parsonian structural functionalism. And at the core of this criticism, at the heart of this criticism of Merton to Parsons, lies the fact that such overreaching theoretical abstraction what the Parsons has initiated such kind of time has not come in sociology. Or at least at this juncture, what Merton thinks, at this juncture, in a sociological tradition, devising a all-encompassing theory, it would not be fruitful. And thus, moving away from Parsons, Merton will initiate the empirical analysis. It means, unlike Parsons, he would not be, or he would not stop with the abstract theorizing. He will make the hypothesis, he will formulate the hypothesis, empirical hypothesis, will try to test it, it will try to post them in the real world, will collect the data himself, and then analyze the result. And in this process, in this attempt, Merton will basically be initiating a new methodological concern. And this methodological concern would help him also revive the functionalism. And in this revival of functionalism at the time of Merton, the classical functionalism would basically be refined, would be modified. But once again I am saying that in this very process of refining, modifying, reviving functionalism, Merton would basically be analyzing both the traditions of functionalism, the sociological one in which Kant, Spencer, Durkheim and Parsons, and the two scholars if I talked about in anthropological one, Bronislaw Malinowski and A.R. Radcliffe Brown. Then he would also be looking at the changes what it has been brought about. Kant, Spencer and Durkheim, they are the armchair scholars. And with the perspective of abstract theorizing somewhere, the similar perspective is found in a Parsons. So armchair scholaring to the reality, that transition which is taking place is from the anthropological perspective. From conjecture to empiricism. It means the movement is taking place from sociological to anthropological tradition in terms of armchair scholaring to the reality. From conjecture based analysis to the empirical analysis. From a diachronic means to chronic time. From a diachronic to synchronic analysis. Such kind of transition is coming out. And Merton will be recognizing the contribution of anthropologists. But on this very basis he will be looking at the certain postulates of the anthropologist, and he will be initiating a newer kind of functional analysis. And that's why a certain questions comes out in terms of the postulates of functional analysis, that is the functional postulate of unity, functional postulate of universality, functional postulate of indispensability. Merton in his life, when we are talking about his career, has witnessed the impact of many scholars. Right from Simpsons, Ederson, Pritham Sorokin, even Parsons he has recognized. I quote one line. He says, out of so many tutors, so many scholars, the young tutor Parsons That has basically influenced a lot to the students. So Parsonian academic credibility is basically being recognized. But Mutton said that I could not follow their footprints. One of the mathematician, Paul Lazarsfeld, would be having the impact or immense impact on the Muttonian methodological journey. And with this impact of Paul Lazarsfeld, Mutton would basically be initiating the empirical research. But in this very process, Mutton will take a middle path in between the macro and the micro tradition of sociology. And this middle path could be understood with the concepts of middle range theories. That's why I say middle range theory is fill in the blanks with any empirical categories. And with this MRT, a new theoretical methodological perspective will be initiated, particularly in American tradition of sociology. Mutton would also become interested in his later phase of life. He became interested in a sociology of science. And in this sociology of science, he basically focused on the interaction between socio-cultural system and science. And when he is analyzing this interaction between socio-cultural system and science, he basically develops what is popularly called Muttonian thesis, explaining the causes and the norms for science, often referred to by the acronym that is called kudos. Maybe sometimes the questions may come from the kudos. Serendipity has been asked, so we may expect the questions from the kudos. It's a Muttonian norms of science. C stands for communalism, that manifests the communal ownership of scientific discovery, according to which the scientist would give up the intellectual property in exchange of recognition and esteem. U stands for universalism, according to which the claims of truth are evaluated in terms of universal and impersonal criteria, and not on the basis of race, class, gender or nationality. You need to understand that Mutton was a Jew. So the second perspective of kudos is universalism. Universal and impersonal criterion would be highlighted. D stands for disinterestedness, according to which scientists are rewarded for acting in ways that outwardly seems to be selfless. And OS stands for organized skepticism, that is, all ideas must be treated or subjected to rigorous scrutiny. If these are the norms for the science, then Mutton also recognizes, while dealing with the kudos, that many a times the scientists violate these principles, either that is communalism or that is universalism or disinterestedness or organized skepticism. They deviate from the scientific principle and norms. It means the ethos of science are violated. Social theory and social structure which we are talking about. There he first talks about the serendipitous pattern. But he also co-authors a book that is Travels and Adventures of Serendipity, which is focused on the unintended consequences. The questions are coming from this, unintended consequences. Earlier in social structure and social theory, he highlighted the concept of serendipity. And the serendipitous pattern is a fairly common experience of observing an unanticipated and anomalous strategic dictum which become an occasion for developing new theories. Simply, serendipity is by chance discovery. And most of the scientific innovations, scientific discoveries, scientific findings, their nature have been serendipitous. By chance discovery has been there. And thus, somewhere, when you're looking at the Merton methodology, Merton will be talking about that sociologists need to be aware of the unintended consequences. We'll be talking about this one the moment we come to the manifest and latent kind of perspective. But Merton is also addressing in sociological methodology the crisis of or crisis in sociological tradition, which Merton thinks that it has occurred or it has been there throughout the history of sociology. So many traditions, solipsism to behaviorism to Popperism, Karl Popper, all have proposed something. But what they say, what their traditions are proposing and what they are doing has no link. Everyone is saying to look at the things from my way. Everyone is saying to look the things. But look the things in my ways. And that way the crisis in sociological tradition has been there. Sociological tradition has been unstable. Since what the sociological traditions are saying, what these propositions they are proposing, and what they are doing has no link. And it is only because of the fact that there seems no linkage between theory and research. So Merton considered the theory and research to be complementary to one another. Theory can influence research in many ways. It will provide a general orientation, may suggest potential problem, may lead to the formulation of fruitful hypothesis, and it may also provide variables that are relevant to the research. Whereas if you are looking at the research helps us in terms of selection of cases, develop the concepts which are important ingredients in a theory. Facts can assassinate theory. Facts can also make you refine the theory, and the research can give birth to theory, its justification, for which you need to go for the research. It means developing a theory, it prods to research. And that research should be based on empirical findings. Discovery of facts becomes the more important in the Mertonian methodology. And when I say just discovery of facts become most important, then mind my line. Rather than the preordained notion, theorizing, it means here, Merton is moving away from the Parsonian perspective of grand scale theorizing. And thus, Merton himself writes, insists that Parsonian search for sorry dear. This viral fever has taken a toll on me. Now Merton is insisting that Parsonians search for total system of sociological theory in which observation of every aspect of social behavior, organization and even change finds a preordained place, has exhilarating challenges but a small promise. as those many encompassing philosophical system that have fallen into deserved disuse. Promise is large, but is yielding nothing. And preordained theory in which the social behavior, organization, even change could be explained by one. It shows a promise. But here at this juncture, it is not proving to be fruitful. And thus Merton says, such attempt of the grand scale theorizing are premature in sociology. And not only premature in terms of the methodological one, but also in a theoretical kind of perspective. Because the accumulation in which would be there in terms of theoretical, methodological one, that has not been completed in a sociological at this stage, at this juncture. It has not been found in sociology. And I quote Merton. Merton says, just as Einstein theory did not emerge without a cumulative research found in scientific theoretical legacy, it means this cumulative theoretical legacy has been there in science. It has not been possible in sociology. So just sociology will have to wait for its Einstein, since as it has not found its Kepler, Newton. Why to talk about Planck, Gibbs or Maxwell? Thus, in absence of this foundation, any attempt to formulate a grand theory would be immature and it would yield nothing, unquote Merton. And here in this attempt, when the sociology will have to wait for its Einstein, since it has not found its Kepler or Newton, this grand scale theorizing seems to be immature. And in this context, Merton would basically be moving towards the formulation of MRTs, the middle range theories, which are in between macro and micro. MRTs are in between the grand scale theory and a fishing expedition of the raw empiricism, which deals with a specific subportion of social life. It is between the minor but necessary working hypotheses that evolve in abundance in day-to-day life and all-inclusive systematic efforts to develop a unified theory. It is the Mertonian MRTs, it is the style of Durkheim suicide supra-individual and Weber's Protestant ethics first act. Middle range are the theories of, or MRTs are the theories of middle range that are intermediate to general theory of social system. They are too remote from the particular doses of social behavior, organization and change to account for what is observed, and those orderly detailed description of particulars that are not generalized at all. Merton appreciates, I said that Merton appreciates the academic caliber of Parsons and seems to be influenced, has a liking for Parsons. But a personal attempt of the grand scale theorizing, which Merton has considered premature. And similarly, we do not find the link between research and theory, that crisis is there. And in this attempt, this MRT is that comes out. Mind me dear, Merton's most of the works, themes which are talking about either in terms of concept of functionalism, sociology of deviance, reference group, all would be using the MRTs. Hence we are not talking MRT, we are talking about MRTs. Not as the middle range theory, middle range theories. And with this middle range theory, Merton moves away from the grand scale theorizing. Merton says that major task today in sociology is to make a theory applicable to the middle range of data. Yet this has not to be considered the sheer description of social life. Rather, middle range are the theories with a limited set of assumptions from which hypotheses can be drawn, which could be tested empirically. It means Merton's focus is more on the pure empiricism. However, irony, look at the sentence. Parsonian grand-scale theorizing is immature. At this juncture of sociological tradition, this has not become, it would not yield anything. Merton is becoming critical of that one, initiating the middle range theories. But there is at least one line which I wanted you to know, that in analyzing or it talking about the middle range theory, Merton says one day on the basis of this, grand scale theorizing would become possible. Now look at the certain kind of dichotomy in a Mertonian analysis. When he talks about the crisis of sociological tradition, there are the different traditions. They are asking you to look at the things, but look at the things in my way. Similarly, he is criticizing the grand scale theory, but hoping that this MRTs will help develop a grand scale theory in sociology. And this MRTs would be central in almost every dimension of this one. Once you have looked at this theoretical, the methodological concerns in a Merton, then concept of functionalism would become the more important one. It is an attempt of revisiting functionalism, which has been one of the most important subject theme in the works of the classical and even in the neoclassical like Parsons and Merton is also moving on the same direction. I said it that he picks up both the sociological and anthropological tradition of functionalism, recognizes the contribution, significance of the anthropological tradition, the changes that has been brought. I told you that the English term function has a root in Latin fungi with the verb functus, which means to serve a purpose. It means functionalism is a social theory that can be conceived as broad system of ideas that was developed in 19th century as a set of beliefs and values which underline utility and functional relationship. Right from the Greek philosophy, when we are talking about Aristotle, the telos, the use of the term telos to serve a purpose, even in terms of Adam Smith, invisible kind of one. Particularly in sociology, when looking at the Kant, Spencer and Durkheim, we find about the functionist analysis. So this tradition, functionist tradition, has been at the core of sociological analysis right since its inception. And perceiving something as determined by the purpose has been there in the Greek philosophy as well. However, some were not only the sociologists, but a new analysis is initiated by Malinowski with his work on Trobriand Islanders and publication of Argonauts of Western Pacific. The structural functionalism received a newer kind of perspective, empirical kind of perspective, also with the works of A.R. Radical Brown, the Andaman Islanders. Merton is speaking all this, analyzing all this, studying all this. But he moves away from them. And when Merton moves away from them, he ensures, mind my line here, he ensures that it should not be teleological. Teleological telos to serve a purpose, right from the Aristotle time, which I just said. And Merton would not be, his analysis would not be open to criticism, will not be accused of inherent conservatism, and neither it would be criticized on the basis of teleological orientation. The status quoist ideology or a status quoist perspective has been accused with the Parsons. No radical thinker has been picked up, either in terms of social action or other kind of perspective. When looking at the Parsonian perspective, Parsons picks up the somewhere a bit conservatives. There is no law mark, there is no law say. And thus Parson has been accused of being a status quoist. Now here Merton is saying that no, the kind of analysis what Merton is illustrating, he is not open to their criticism of inherent conservatism, and neither his analysis of functionalism would be criticized for having the teleological orientation. Teleological, that is to serve a purpose. Like all functionalists, Merton is perceiving society as a system of interrelated parts, contributing to promote cohesiveness and maintaining equilibrium. Merton says that functional analysis is the most promising, but possibly less codified. Promise is there, but in a contemporary times it has been not codified as it deserves. And why? Because it has developed on many intellectual fronts. But development of it in many intellectual fronts is in terms of SADs and patches rather than in depth. But despite this, Merton acknowledges the functionalist analysis and the propositions, the perspectives what the functionalist analysis will be bringing. Merton is acknowledging that one. And then Merton is also not looking function as an idea, because if you look at function as an idea, it could either be radical or conservativist. Neither he is looking at in terms of teleological one. And thus, Merton is perceiving function or functionalism as a concept. And as a concept, the multi-dimensional analysis will be coming out. And in this very perspective, Merton says, what the functionalists, the previous functionalists are concerned of? That whenever they picked up any institution, whenever they picked up any custom or norms or any other thing, they were basically concerned with what does it do? What purpose does it serve? Merton considered it to be a very simplified analysis. And in this way, this process, Merton will try to codify and systematize functional analysis in terms of function, dysfunction, non-function, manifest or latent function, functional alternative or substitute. And that way Merton will develop a new paradigm in the analysis of functionalism. I just said that when you are looking at Merton's functionalist analysis, it is recognizing the anthropological tradition. But he is critically introspecting their postulates of functional analysis, that is functional postulate of unity, which is based on the biological analogy that views societies as a well integrated and consistent whole, the elements of which contribute to the maintenance of social system. The second postulate is a functional postulate of universality. That since the maintaining of the whole system is there, because that way the unity has been there. Then when he talks about the universality, it is basically based on the assumption that all standardized socio-cultural forms have positive function. And this very third postulate, the functional postulate of indispensability, is based on the assumption that social pattern is well established, fulfills certain social needs, hence considered indispensable for the system. However, Merton has a certain reservations. Now, Merton is critically analyzing. In terms of the functional postulate of unity, Merton says, if you look at the anthropologists whose concerns are with the simpler society, where the anthropologists have assumed that standardized social institutions, beliefs and practices being functional for society has been exaggerated. Since cultural items, mind the line, since cultural items, Merton says, since the cultural items do not perform uniformly. Neither uniformly for the entire society or for every member of society. Mind the line, beta. This question would be there. Thus, it cannot be ensured, it cannot be said or established that everything is good for everyone in society. Anthropologists have relied more on the simpler societies, which are fairly static and homogeneous. But when you are looking at the modern society, which is not homogeneous, it is heterogeneous, complexity has emerged out. Higher degree of specialization and differentiation has taken place. Thus, considering that any belief, any pattern would be functioning universally or will be benefiting all, it will not be working for everyone. And Merton is also looking at, in terms of universality, that when you talk about a standardized socio-cultural forms of a positive function, but positive function for whom? Is it for the entire society? Any pattern whose function cannot be readily identified have been ignored by the anthropologist. What is good for one cannot be good for another. Now look at Merton slowly and gradually, while critically introspecting these postulates, is formulating his own yardstick, his own assumptions to build the theory in functionalism. And when you talk about indispensable, that they perform certain functions, fulfill certain social needs, hence they are indispensable to the social system. For example, Malinowski considered magic to be indispensable. Now Merton is saying that intertwined concept of indispensability and irreplaceability flatly excludes the concept of functional alternative. Social needs could be answered in many ways, which require sociologists to search for substitutes. Since Merton argues that people must be willing to admit that there exist various structural functional alternatives within the society. And if the people are admitting that there exist various structural functional alternatives, then you should not consider something to be indispensable, irreplaceable. And that way, Merton is moving toward the concept of functional alternative. The anthropologists are believing that there are certain functional prerequisites in order to survive. Parsons is also talking about the functional prerequisites. Merton is sharing their views. But he asserts that a particular institution is not the only one to fulfill that function. And if the particular one is not the only one to fulfill that function, there is a whole range of alternatives. And as a sociologist, we should try to search such alternatives, functional alternatives which are there. And if you are looking at the searching for the alternatives, then you would not be accused of a status quoist conservatism, as Parsons was accused of. Once Merton has critically introspected these postulates to arrive at the concept of functional alternative, now he is moving towards that what are the certain meanings of function. The 5: function as a public gathering or occasion, function as an occupation, function associated with social position, function as used in mathematical formula, and the 5th one, function as a procedures that contributes to the maintenance of the system. Merton emphasis is in the 5th meaning of the function, that function as a procedure that contributes to the maintenance of the system. And views function as those observed consequences that make for adaptation or adjustment to that given system. But what if the one institution which you have considered to be functional, it does not function? Then now Merton is enlarging the scope of the function analysis. So along with the function, Merton here brings the concept that is called dysfunction. And he picks up the notion of dysfunction. And how does he define? He says, dysfunctions are those observed consequences that lessen or decrease the adjustment of that given system. And when you say functional, the Merton is talking about using the concept of dysfunction. It also relates to the question, functional for whom? The functionists have always, and particularly Talcott Parsons, they have always assumed that the need met is societal, universalistic. But Merton argues that not all parts of social system work together for the good of the whole. The recognition of dysfunction by Merton also helps sociology to escape status quoist conservatism. Teleological, मान के नहीं चल रहे हैं. It means Merton, by picking up the concept of dysfunction, is basically trying to provide the detail and contradictions of the overall concept. One group's function can serve as other group's dysfunction. And could be possible that it turns out to be functional and dysfunctional for the same group. For example, Merton says that certain degree of cohesiveness is good for the productivity of the society, which is considered functional. But this degree of cohesiveness, when it surpasses a threshold or certain threshold, it could also become dysfunctional. Arthur talks about the non-function. Now from here, in analysis, you move towards the manifest and latent. In terms of the manifest and latent, Merton is basically focusing on the motives of the action, in which some actions or structures may perform either or both. Manifest functions are those observed consequences that are intended recognized by the participants in system of actions concerned, whereas latent functions are those consequences which are neither recognized nor intended. Latent is the unintended or unrecognized result. Merton, by distinguishing between these two, that is the manifest and latent, tries to bring more meaning or meaningful and scientific analysis to the concept of functionalism. Now when we are looking at the manifest and latent, let me what I talked about in terms of Durkheim's, that Durkheim's treatment of religion, where religion serves the manifest function of solving the human quest for ultimate meaning, then the latent function is providing social identity and solidarity. Yet another example referred by Merton is a Western's theory of leisure class, where accumulation of material position has a manifest function of making life more comfortable, and the latent function is to provide status and prestige in society. Merton is also providing the example of hoppy rain dance, that whenever there is a drought, rain is not coming, all the members of the group, they gather at a hillock to perform the rain dance to appease the rain deity, with this belief that this dance will not only appease the rain deity, but the rain will follow aftermath. It means when they have gathered at the hillock to perform the rain dance, it is a recognized one, intended one, that is a manifest one. But when the entire members of a group have gathered at the hillock, it has also brought the solidarity. But at that moment they had not come for that solidarity. That is the latent function, which was an unrecognized one. It is not merely increasing solidarity, but relaxation is there, entertainment is taking place. And thus the custom continues. Merton further writes that latent function in certain activities may be recognized by the interest group, but not intended by the sponsor. For example, the intended form of establishing a new university in a town is to serve the needs of higher education. But the latent function that is significant boost to local economy is certainly recognized by the business community. It means what is latent to some is manifest to others. Sometimes the unintended consequences manifest themselves in a myriad ways, Merton says. In Hopi rain dance, or a Muslim taking in a holy pilgrimage to Makkah, or a Hindu organizing an elaborate ritualistic ceremony to write the name of favorite deity, million times, basically explains that why such functions persist. Whether these activities fulfill the manifest function or not, they have important social consequences like promoting social solidarity, enhancing the social status of the actor. At the same time, there could also be possibility that what is functional for one could be dysfunctional for another, or what is functional at one time may be dysfunctional at another time. For example, some businessman decided to open a casino in a remote area, downtown. That is the business proposal. They wanted to earn profit. But in this very process, the local economy has started developing out. The locals started getting the new employability. With this new employability, the new market development, the new activities emerging out, the quality of life of the people improved. It means it was a functional. But with the passage of time, if all these people who have got the new employability, they become addicted to casino, they become addicted to alcohol, then it is a dysfunctional. So what is functional at one time may be dysfunctional at another time. And you could also use the manifest and latent one. either in terms of gambling or in terms of alcoholism. We'll be also looking at improper socialization of the child, lack of parental control, marital disorder or a discord, increasing rate of divorce, rejections, such kind of things you could look at. So when you pick up the manifest and latent, try to look at the certain examples, think on the certain examples. And I said that mutton, with this function, dysfunction, non-function, manifest, latent, functional alternative, has refined the classical and provided the new protocol of functional analysis. And I had said that if you look at mutton, mutton is saying that as a sociologist, we should be concerned of the unintended consequences. Unintended consequences are the actions which are both intended and unintended. Everyone is aware of intended consequences, but unintended consequences are more difficult to recognize. Mutton, in his essay, Unintended Consequences of Social Action, uncovers wide field of human activities. However, Mutton is making it very clear that unintended consequences and latent function are not same. Question hai beta? Mind the line. Latent functions are one type of unintended consequences, functional for the designated system. However, to Mutton, there are also two other types of unintended consequences. Number one, that are dysfunctional for a designated system, that is latent dysfunction, and those which are of no use to the system. Either neither affect functionally nor dysfunctionally, it means non-functional consequences. And Mutton is focusing on unintended consequences. With this very perspective of latent and unintended one, you will find about certain questions on corruption, certain fine questions in bureaucracy. Some questions have been there. You just try to look at, try to think on that very perspective. This very distinction between manifest and latent would make the sociologist to go beyond the reasons that individual give for their actions. And thus, much needed multidimensionality, which has to be tested empirically, has been initiated by Mutton in a functions analysis. I said that what about the themes which are talking about with this? The two themes which are left, that is the sociology of deviance and reference group. Same MRTs would be used by you. I'll just take 2 minutes break and then we'll begin that one in terms of sociology of deviance, with which Mutton will establish himself for once and all as a very serious sociologist. Now let's begin that one day. Now when we have talked about the concept of functionalism, one very important contribution to the sociological tradition and precisely the sociology of deviance would be Mutton's analysis of the deviance. And it shows that throughout his life Mutton has contributed enormously to the sociological tradition. But I will not hesitate making this statement that Mutton became more famous for the sociology of deviance, which is still considered to be one of the best masterpieces in the sociology of deviance. And with this work, with this analysis, Mutton would establish himself for once and all as a very serious scholar, serious sociologist, analytical scholar in the sociological tradition. Mutton, bound by his own methodology of middle range theories, initiates a new analytical framework by utilizing the factors which have been very typical of functional analysis. So in the functional analysis, what has been very typical? Cultural goals, institutionalized means, within which he also develops the theory of anomy as an independent variable. It means when we are talking about sociologically, Martin's theory of deviance develops from his analysis of relationship between culture, social structure and anomy. Culture would be viewed as an organized set of normative values governing behavior common to members of that designated group or society. Whereas social structure is an organized set of relationship in which the members of group or society are variously implicated. But this social structure also implicates a balance between the cultural goals and the institutionalized means to achieve it. But when there is a disjunction or discontinuity between cultural norms, cultural goals and institutionalized means, anomy would be emerging out. So in a simple sentence, it is a disjunction or discontinuity between cultural means and goals. Anomy reflects imbalance between culturally approved goals and institutionalized means to achieve it. And Martin would be linking this anomy to the deviance. And once he relates it to the deviance, mind the line here, Martin argues that culture and structure may have dysfunctional consequences leading to deviance within society. Anomy as a concept was introduced in sociology by Durkheim, which he talked about, Durkheim's perspective. Some analysis of anomy is found in a Parsonian perspective, that when the self-alienated goals takes precedence over the collective goal orientation, anomy may take place. But Martin once again is saying that Millerian theory is between macro and micro. So he is not only looking at it from the individual perspective, he is also looking at the macro canvas. And thus raises the question, can the social structure constrain the individual to deviate? And in this very perspective of deviation, Martin will basically be talking about the concept of anomy. It means Martin would clearly be separating structural elements of social and cultural structure into two polar extremes. That is socially approved goals and culturally accepted institutionalized means, which are more or less integrated into the designated system or group, and which will provide the framework of social structure recognized and desired by the society or group. But when everyone is not getting the accessibility on the goals and the means, they will deviate from it. So they will deviate either from the means, either from the goals, or they may deviate from both. It means social structure may put a constraint on the individuals to deviate. You find such kind of questions. And in this way, you basically go by this diagram in terms of reflecting Martin's contribution. This is the old diagram which you everywhere you find about in terms of this one. You do. Hand is running faster than the brain now. Ways of individual adaptation. Then you talk about the culturally accepted institutionalized means. And there you talk about the socially approved goals. And 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. Here is conformity plus, then innovation, that is minus plus, then ritualism plus minus, patriotism minus, and rebellion plus minus. This is the old diagram which you do. Here plus connotes conformity, yes. And minus is a denial. It means plus is acceptance and minus is rejection. Plus minus is basically rejection of the existing one and replacement with the new one. Now in this diagram, sometimes the certain question comes out. And very clever questions have been asked. Then can a person at the same time be conformist and a deviant? So here, in terms of this, all these four are the example of deviance. That is innovation, ritualism, patriotism and rebellion. Now how do you conceptually develop anomy? Disjunction between the goals and the means. If you look at closely, only at the two, innovation and ritualism, you find about the disjunction. So this is basically anomy. So at a given point of time, one who is a conformist is also a deviant. Now look at, either you are a conformist or a deviant, but at a given point of time, at the same time, one person could be conformist and a deviant. If such kind of questions have been asked, you need to place it. I had told you very first day that whenever the certain questions of contemporary, one certain twisted question comes out, with a certain example trying to provide you, you try to locate that in terms of your development of the concepts. I'll draw yet another diagram for you in terms of this, because this is, I always think this is very old. Everyone is looking at. So here you make like this. Socially approved goals. Institutionalized means. New goal, new means. All right. And there you also talk about acceptance, rejection. Here you talk about acceptance and rejection. So here is conformist. All right. And then you talk about ritualism, no, this is innovation day. Two, three, four. Acceptance. Ritualism. Innovation. And retreatism. Only thing would be there in terms of here, let me make it more clear. Acceptance, rejection. And this is institutionalized means. So look at where the acceptance will come out, where the rejection, acceptance will come out. Draw this diagram. That would be the new one. And mutton would be from here, we talk about, give the very brief in terms of mutton placing anomy within deviance as a disjunction between means and goals. That are also showing the possibility that at the same time an individual could be conformist and a deviant. This example I have shown you. He applies it to the American society, where the American goal is monetary success, is emphasized strongly, but without corresponding emphasis on legitimate avenues to achieve the dream. All subscribe, Mutton says, all subscribe to American dreams, but the ways in which people go about obtaining the dream is not same, because everyone has not got the similar advantage and opportunities, thereby leading to considerable amount of strain which would lead to deviance. Thus Mutton writes that ambition, which was once considered American cardinal virtue, has now turned into American vice, cardinal vice, and resulting outcome is anomy, which is dysfunctional to society in general and particularly to the group who lack this accessibility on a means and goals. So you talk about, analyze, talk about the conformist ritualism, innovation, ritualism, relativism and rebellion. Talk on that very perspective, and that way this question could be there. Also try to provide some examples. The lower social class in terms of innovation, the middle class or the cautious bureaucrat in terms of ritualism, the chronic drunkards, the vagabonds, those who live in society but not for the society is relativism. And sometimes you may find about the questions in terms of rebellion, on terms of the traffic light and others. Use it. Same diagram here. Once again I am saying, if such kind of question comes out, recall back the diagram, recall back the theory, the propositions what the thinker has talked about, and if you think rationally, you would be able to answer that such kind of questions. So the first mode is conformity, second mode is innovation, third one is ritualism, fourth relativism, and fifth is rebellion. And from here, very little has been asked. Sometimes in a short note, sometimes there in terms of the reference group. But this reference group would be somewhere we will be talking about the similar perspective in terms of MRTs. This concept was explained, the reference group concept was explained by many scholars earlier. Herbert Hyman first talked about this concept and applied it to the group against which an individual relates or evaluates his or her own conduct. He distinguished between membership group to which individual belongs and reference group. Later on, Theodore Newcomb used reference group to help explain the changing values and attitudes Henry Sumner, he basically talked about the concept of in-group, but Martin broadens the concept of reference group. Martin is in his association with his associates, Kitts, provides a systematic functional formulation to the concept in the classical contribution to the theory of reference group behavior. It has been edited in the edited book of Martin and Lagersfeld. Along with his associate Kitts, Martin is now providing this data. Martin is including both the in-group and out-group. There is a membership and non-membership group. Martin is a social theory and social structure distinguishes between reference and interaction group. The interaction group are more general part of the individual, but do not set the normative standards. Martin also specifies the circumstances under which individual selects a membership or a non-membership group. For normative reference group, in the mobile society, non-membership groups are likely to be chosen. Broadly, the perspective of reference group can be analyzed in terms of individual's form of reference and source of ordering experiences, perceptions, cognition, and the idea of self, thereby becoming important for determining a person's self-identity, attitude, social ties, and roles. And in this perspective, in a Martin's analysis, reference group, normative group, you just talk about the reference group. The reference group is then simply reference group is the one in which some manner individuals, either in collectivity or in person, takes into account in course of selecting a behavior from the state of alternatives. It means reference group will help the actor in certain goals in terms of action or attitude which could normative or comparative. However, even though belonging to a group, a person can aspire to be the member of another group and may try to emulate the behavior of other group. Thus, the objective of reference group is to evaluate or criticize those processes by which either an individual compares or rejects the value standard of that group. And in this context, Martin would be highlighting the two central features. That is, adoption of the values of another group or individual. And number two is comparing one's group with another group. It means when Martin is focusing, using this term, he is basically focusing on those established patterns by which members of a group interact, since the behavioral standard of that group one belongs to is known to him. Though there may be possibility that despite being a member of a group, an individual can aspire to be the member of another group that he does not belong to. It means the definition, analysis of the non-membership group is based on the parameters that individual is free from normative standard of that group. Or individual may compare him or themselves with a reference group of people who occupy the social role to which the individual aspires to. The individuals who are guided by the certain motives may have the possibility to come in contact with other group, which may provide the base for normative or comparative reference one. I'll say that the moment you make a sentence, sometimes many times we say, when we abhor someone's action, we say, I'll become anything not like you. Here, the behavioral, normative behavioral of our group is being used to compare others. I aspire to be like him. Here, the reference group behavior is basically being used in terms of this one. But in this whole analysis, when the in-group members, in-group, out-group, membership, non-membership group, reference group, normative group, comparative group, this is all analysis which Martin is speaking. Martin's analysis of reference group is also using the two other concepts. That is called the concept of relative deprivation and anticipatory socialization. Very simple one. In terms of the relative deprivation, Mutton takes the empirical reference of the book American Soldiers, which has been written by Samuel Stauffer, Suchman, Itel. Itel means more than one scholar. However, you need to remember that Mutton is concerned of group psychology than the individual psychology. And thus, you pick up the examples of soldiers at home, soldiers recruited at border, soldiers recruited overseas. So if these are the three set of soldiers we have picked up, then we find about at one time, when the third one is comparing himself with the second one, those who are posted at border, he says at least they are there in the country, I have been posted out. Or those who are at the border, when they compare with the first one, who are the soldier friends who are on the leave at home, he said they might be leading a very normal enjoyment filled life. So that way, one group seems to be in these three sets of soldiers. One set of soldiers seems to be relatively deprived and another seems to be relatively privileged. But this deprivation is time specific here. Because those who are at a home on leave, after that, they will be either recruited at border or maybe overseas. Those who are recruited overseas may come either at the border or may go to home on leave. So the relative deprivation is basically time specific. Can I use this very line to criticize Marx? That in a capitalist perspective, when we look at the proletariats are relatively deprived in comparison to the bourgeois, then this deprivation is time specific. When you compare with this with socialism and communism and capitalism. And Mutton is not only giving this example, the three sets of soldiers, Mutton is also giving the examples that when the married soldier compares himself with the unmarried soldiers, when the soldiers compare themselves with their officers, they feel relatively deprived. But this is membership group. But when the soldier compares himself with his non-soldier friends, he feels their kind of discipline and sacrifice what the country wants from him, it is not wanted from them. And thus, the membership or non-membership group, in and out group, both could be there. And in this very perspective, once you have talked about the relative deprivation in terms of reference group, then another concept related is anticipatory socialization, which is the process through which individual in advance tries to emulate the behavioral pattern of a reference group. And once you have done this one in terms of the reference group, the relative deprivation, and also talk about the anticipatory socialization, then this very perspective could be used. And I don't know whether you will, if I ask you to recall back Sanskritization of M.N. Srinivas, which you're talking about yesterday in terms of, or we'll be talking about in terms of the caste. No, I have not talked about it. We'll be talking about in terms of the caste and more precisely the debate between open versus closed. So Srinivas Sanskritization will basically be demystifying or demystify the myth that Indian society is a closed system, a static one. The elements of mobility would be present within this. We will find about that how Sanskritization is a cultural imitation built in the structure of caste, how the lower class imitate the lifestyle of the upper caste. Now in this way we have go through the Sanskritization you might be aware of. You look at you apply all this, the reference group, you apply the relative deprivation and anticipatory socialization. And that way, this contribution of Mutton will be coming on that very perspective. And thus, once again, I am saying that when you are reading Parsons, please have a long sitting, particularly with the Parsons. And once you have finished Parsons, note it down, look at the questions, visualize that such kind of questions comes out, these are the answers, anticipated some domain. Then with a little break, you also try to go through the matter, and more precisely the methodological concerns of matter, along with the Parsons. So the comparison between the methodological concerns of Parsons and Merton could be done. And that way the very domain of middle range theories in a Merton, that will be understood. And all these three themes which we are talking about in terms of concept of functionalism, or we are talking about deviance or reference group, the same MRTs has to be applied. So you try to, you can bifurcate that one, you can read this one later on. But I request that when you have done Parsons and Parsonian methodology basically, then in the same sitting you just also try to look at the Mertonian methodology, so that you would be able to have a deeper insights, better understanding, and that way the things will be coming. Apart from these 5 scholars, yet another scholar has been G.H. Mead. I don't know how you have approached G.H. Mead, whether you have gone through the influences or not, right? George Herbert Mead. And same perspective we pick up. Methodological concerns, and intellectual background. Self and identity, this is the only syllabus. I'm sorry to say this line, many times I say, I don't know whether UPSC really wanted to keep Mead or not. Mead's questions on social actions could be there in terms of comparative with the Weber, with the Parsons. Such kind of questions could be framed from there. But they have not given that a scope to the Mead. A very concise perspective of the George Herbert Mead that has been talked about. So in the methodological concerns, the first concern would be basically in terms of symbolic interactionism. When I started talking about sociology, science, theoretical strands, we talked about something on symbolic interactionism. And I quoted Bloomer over there. That concept will be popularized by Bloomer. Mead, Charles Cooley, they all would be the symbolic interactionist. And symbolic interactionism will also be non-positivist method. I drawn one diagram in terms of the two actors. Will I draw the diagram even today? And then when you look at the intellectual background, then there will be impact of German idealism. And there is also an impact of Charles Darwin, that generalize others, I and me. You will be placing that one there. Only with even if the reference if you give it, certainly you will be fetching more marks. Impact of Einstein's relativity. With which he will be basically taking the non-positive stand, moving from the positivism. Impact of the behaviorists. And with this he will be building his own perspective in terms of here concept of self. And when you have started going through concept of self, it is basically the two parts, the interaction between I and me. So here you talk about the concept of I and me. Mind my lines. And there is I in me. Alright. And there will be many I's and many me's. And in this very perspective, when you talk about self, talk about development of self, play stage and game stage. I don't know whether you are aware of this concept or this quotation that a child can play alone, game requires a team. So in the game stage, the certain idea of generalized others will start coming out. And in this very perspective, mid's contribution has to be talked about. But let me say that when we are talking about mid to be a sociologist, it will be too much dear. Mid is basically a social psychologist. He is a philosopher, a social analyst, affiliated with the Chicago School of Thought. And that Chicago School of Thought is considered to be one of the most important pillars in the critical development of social theory. And mid will emerge as one of the most important pillars in the theory of symbolic interactionism. I give you some lines so that you can understand. Symbolic interactionism is a school of thought which emphasizes on common set of symbols and thinking possessed by people in a group. It means it is primarily a socio-psychological perspective which focuses on individual with self, interaction between individuals, internal thoughts, emotions and social behavior, where the form of interaction that emerges is from a situation concern. It is studying the group life, the human behavior, by emphasizing on the social action and social processes, in which the interaction is continuously defined, redefined and reshaped in the sense that how the individual understands the world around him or around them and how they socially constitute the meaning. It means symbolic interactionism is a micro level theory, primarily focused on the relationship among the individuals within the group or society and the communication, that is the exchange of meanings through languages and symbols, by which people will be making use of the sense of world. However, symbolic interactionism views actor as an active agent who saves the world, not simply being acted upon, not simply as a passive. So there, if you remember, I had drawn this diagram. I don't know how I will be able to. You please try to, you may be good in drawing. Here is norms, value, status, role. Same set I am talking about: norms, values, status, role. And we are making the two, that is here the individual who is looking here. Alright? It means his back is there in terms of norms, values, status and role. So he will understand it, and then he will indulge into the behavior. Because he has been basically groomed, socialized with these norms, values, status and role. This is the functionalist analysis. But here when you are looking at, the actor is not having his back to the norms, values. Rather, the actor is basically looking at this and in a different situation, he will basically be evaluation. On the basis of evaluation, he will understand it. On the basis of understanding, he will indulge in a behavior. So this is basically a passive recipient. And this is active agent. He is an active self. This is, I said, functionalist. And this could also be used in terms of positivism. And here this is symbolic interactionist. This is non-positivist. It means in a symbolic interactionism, self becomes the central. As an acting organism and not merely the passive receptible field which you have shown there, which simply receives and responds. It also means that symbolic interactionism will be providing the analysis of social life different from that of the functionalist. The functionalists who are basically focusing on the norms, which implies that most interactions are fixed in advance. That a straight jacket approach is not provided by the symbolic interactionist. It means the functionalists are providing a straight jacket approach. And Mead is considered to be one of the giants in the symbolic interactionism. However, I said it, and once again I am saying, however, it has to be remembered that it was Herbert Blumer, a student of Mead, who coined the term symbolic interactionism and outlined its basic premises. What are the basic premises? Number one, human interacts with the things which is based on meaning ascribed to the thing. Number two, the ascribed meaning of the things come from individuals' interaction with others in a group or society. Number three, the meaning of things are interpreted by an actor while dealing with the things in a specific circumstances. Mead in his lifetime wrote many articles, published, unpublished, but it is also a fact that he could not got published any book. But after his death, his works were published, unpublished. They were all compiled by his wife, his friends, and the 4 books came out, in which the syllabus which we are talking about is basically mind, self and society. In a sociological tradition, when we are looking at Mead, we find about one difference, that most of the classical, neoclassical scholars, they were basically dissented, alienated one. Either you were talking about Pareto, you talk about Marx, or even Durkheim, you talk about Parsons, you talk about Martin, somehow or other in their life, at one stage or another in their life, they were basically disheartened, they were basically alienated. And in this very process, somewhere they were marginalized in society. But this very perspective of marginality is not applied to G.H. Mead. He has been a part and parcel of the American society. His family of origin, his education, lifestyle, professional career, all somehow or other show a conformity to American values of democracy, social reforms, and scientific optimism. Mead's intellectual development reflects the impact of many scholars, within which German idealism of Hegel, natural selection, adaptation, evolutionism of Charles Darwin are the most significant one. Now I quote two scholars. Michel Ablofia comments that Mead's indebtedness, especially to German idealism, has not been addressed in depth what it merits. But Hans Joa, he writes that the key figure in the beginning of Mead's emphasis has been Charles Darwin. It means Ablofia, A-B-L-O-U-F-I-A, Ablofia, M-I-T-C-H-E-A-A, Michel Ablofia is basically talking about the impact of German idealism, Hegel. Hans Joa, H-A-N-S-J-O-S, Hans Joa is basically talking about the impact of Charles Darwin on Mead. Now let me say two lines, try to understand the two lines. Mead's emphasis on the process of emergence is indebted to Hegel. Hegel earlier has rejected the division of society into a priori. A priori means fixed category. Since Hegel insists that reality one encounters is in a continuous process of transformation. Remember that one thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where the new form emerges from the old one, in which dialectics as a method becomes important. Hegel also analyzes identity in terms of subject-object orientation, alienation, objectification and estrangement. So, previously Hegel will be talking about in terms of metaphysical one, that labor is the men's species being, which he talked about in Marx. So there is a universal relationship between object and subject relationship. The idea of subject to become an object for oneself as a result of taking role of others or attitude of others who are involved with him in the process of interaction, if such kind of lines are coming in Mead, it will be indebted to German idealism, not precisely the Hegelian perspective. The notion of reflexivity plays an important role in Mead's theory of mind and self. And this very perspective which we are talking about in terms of the process of emergence or the identity, it will also be becoming very central in the Mead's theory of generalized others, that is the expectations of the wider community which one belongs to. It means when you are talking about the generalized others, in one line mentioning that the very influence of German idealism could be found in the Mead's analysis of the generalized others, so then talk about this one. And what Mead is saying? Mead is saying through this reflectivity, social process is brought into the experience of individual in it. It means reflectiveness is an essential condition within the social process for the development of mind. And when we come to the Darwin, the impact of Hegel on Mead is matched by Charles Darwin. The assumptions of both Hegel and Darwin's are different from one another, are antithetical to one another. If Hegel is emphasizing on the philosophical explanation, then Darwin is focusing on biological theorizing. If Hegel is focusing on the idea that reality is in constant process of evolutionary emergence, then Darwin described life as a process of giving rise to varying structural forms. However, Mead finds a fundamental harmony between these two, that is Hegel and Darwin. In Darwin, he sees an incorporation of indeterminism, mind the word, the incorporation of indeterminism and novelty, and also the random variation of selection in environmental conditions, showing flexibility in life. Thus to Mead, Hegelian dialectics parallels Darwin's mode of selection. In other words, Mead's right that the random variation of action, I repeat, the random variation of action presented by I is selected by me. I and me. And Mead's development of self is intricately linked to the language, which is also influenced by the German scholar Wilhelm Wundt and his analysis of gestures. You might have gone through the dog fight when the dog barks, another dog responds with a barking. But that is a non-significant gesture. And in humans we find about the significant gestures. So in that way, this very study of gesture or the very perspective of gesture which we will be finding about in terms of significant and non-significant in Meads is indebted to the Wilhelm Wundt, the German scholar. Gesture can be understood as the behavioral response of organism to stimuli from other organism. Here Mead provides the famous dog fight example of dog fight, in which a dog barks and the second dog either barks or backs away, or he growls or runs away. Here the meaning of barking is found in the response to the second organism to the first. But the dog do not understand the meaning of gesture. Rather they simply respond, which Mead refers as non-significant gesture. And thus Mead says that for a gesture to be significant, it must call out in a second organism a response which is functionally identical to the response that the first organism anticipates. It means gesture to be significant, it must mean same to both the organism, the first and second organism. Since meaning involves the capacity to consciously anticipate how the organism will respond. This capacity arises through a vocal gesture, where it can be a word, it could be a phrase, and thus when vocal gesture is used, the individual making the gesture responds in the same manner. It means, to Mead, gesture becomes significant when it is implicitly arrives at the same response or arises the same response in the second organism, implying that gesture becomes significant when there is a meaning, attitude or idea behind it. The smoker extending his hand over the pack of cigarette and a lighter, and the non-smoker either opening the door or the windows or moving out. None has said something. But there has been an attitude, there is a meaning, there has been an idea that has been responded. That response has arise in a second organism. And that way, the non-significant and significant gesture that could be talked about. It means when you are talking about Mead with this one is also providing the example of social action, consisting of two or more actors influencing each other through the conversation of gesture, the significant gesture. It also implies that significant symbol of gestures depends on common interpretation of meaning, in which language is important. Mead is also influenced by the Einstein theory of relativity. Try to understand this one better. I'll try to be simple, you try just listen this one. And if possible, quote that one in terms of criticism of positivism. Is influenced by the theory of relativity of Einstein. He finds that Einstein is important in illustrating relativity of a perspective, implying that individual's action is variable in terms of time, space and past experiences. I repeat, with this theory of relativity, now what Mead is saying? that an individual's action is variable in terms of time, space and past experiences. More generally, relatively means that social is the emergent phenomena. It means the theory of relativity is also making us understand that science must take into account a multiplicity of perspective simultaneously. Since as one changes one's perspective, the observed relationship with the object also changes. And here, mind the line beta, here with this Mead moves away from the deterministic views of positivists, whom Mead attributes to be pre-Newtonian phase, providing room neither for multiplicity of perspective nor for indeterminism. Thus, through symbolic interactionism, Mead now moved towards the non-positivist stand. And he primarily analyzes the development of self and a mind. To mean mind and self develop in society, and society also changes by the individual. This dialectical interdependence between individual and society is predicted on communication. And the individual and society's ability to understand one another. This very development of mutual understanding in Mead's view is the adaptive advance separating humans from animals, since humans are able to understand collective action through communication. The central point in human communication is the ability to take the role of others, reflexivity we are talking about, ability to take the attitude of others, the ability to take the same attitude towards oneself that the community expects. It means the essential condition for the development of mind is that individual is acting in response to the environment. When self objectifies himself, he attains self-consciousness. Self-consciousness can be seen in children playing, when children refer themselves as Doraemon, Tom, Jerry, Nobita, and they do this. So Mead writes that human beings are only human when reflecting mind takes self as an object. I repeat the line. Mead is saying human beings are only human when reflective mind takes self as an object. It also means that there is no mind, there is no self separated from society. Self and society are intertwined. They develop in society. The reflexivity would allow the individuals to work together, to envisage the future, to imagine objects or any situation that are not physically present. हम बोलते हैं ना कि हम ऐसा करेंगे, ऐसा होगा तो ऐसा होगा. So this is basically reflexivity. So envision future would also be coming from there. It also makes us to plan the future behavior towards an object and situation, implying that mind and self develop from the social experience, especially taking the role of others, including the generalized others, which is an individual's organized community and social group. आसान हो गया. अब यहां से now you just speak up. The concept of generalized other, which is central to Mead's, which involves individual's ability to objectify self by taking the role of others. Generalized others exert social control, thereby ensuring certain predictability. कुछ predict करेंगे. That certain predictability in a human's life. Thus from here, Mead moves towards the stages through which the capacity to take the role of others develop and the predictability of social life. The capacity to develop the ability to take the roles of others takes place in two stages. You might be aware of that is a play stage and game stage. In a play stage, the child takes the roles of few significant others, like parents. Sometimes if the parent is a doctor, then he'll put a stethoscope and he'll try behaving as if he's checking you. If the father is a cop, he'll put the gun and he's chasing the thieves. So here, he is taking the role of significant others. But in a game stage, it involves the ability to understand the connectivity between the roles. Mead provides the example of the baseball, where once you become the part of the game of the baseball, then you need to be batter, you need to be fielder, you need to be bowler. Thus, the child will learn the art of putting himself in the place of others, taking the multiple roles. And in this very perspective, the certain expectations of others players would also be known to him. And in this very perspective we are talking about, and I said it, that one of the great quote of Mead is that child can play alone, but the game requires a team. And in his Mind, Self and Society, Mead is basically arguing that self emerges by the process of socialization in the context of society itself, which one is a part of. The very content of self-realization emerges from the prescription of how others perceive, since on the basis of this judgment is made, consequently one tries to internalize expectations, role obligations, and consequently develops self. Man is not born with self. Rather, self develops in society. Self and society are intertwined. It also reflects the transition from I to me. The self that develops or emerges from taking the role of others, it is Mead calls me. Me contains the knowledge of roles, structure, values, beliefs, and the implication for the self. It also represents self-control as an expression of me against I. I, on the other hand, is an unorganized response of an organism. It is a spontaneous disposition, an impulse to act. Though we also need to remember that a certain spontaneous incalculability of I allows for certain degree of innovation and freedom from the control of others. A question, this line could be there in terms of sometimes when you go for the interview, after the mains you'll be going for the interview, you talk about the hobbies. Mead could be talked about. Hobbies make you move away from a routinization, the routine behavior. And thus I read, it also means that certain incalculable spontaneity of I allows for certain degree of innovation and freedom from the control of others. I is a creative, imaginative part of self, which Mead believes is most prominent in the artists, creative mans, who indulge in unconventional act, manifesting a strong expression of I. Self consists of the acting I, where self is a subject and acted upon by me, where self is an object. Thus, self is an ongoing process between these two phases, that is I and me, enabling us to understand the conscious perspective. And if self does not have these two phases, there will be no conscious perspective and there will be nothing novel in experience. The self that develops by taking the role of others is me. In the symbolic interaction between I and me, which are talking about the two parts of the self, usually me prevails. But on a certain occasions, in an impulsive, uncontrolled behavior, I takes the precedence over me. Road rage, if we are talking about. Here the I has become more prominent than me. And when I becomes more prominent, it also means that me does not determine the expression of I. However, in unusual occasions, I and me won't be distinct from one another. And that could occur. There is no difference between I and me. That could occur in a highly emotional and collective situations, such as religious or patriotic occasions, when there is a peculiar sense of exaltation. Thus, the reaction one is seeking within himself, for oneself, he is also looking it from the others. all individuals see self-expression, especially when confined by routine work. Routinization prompts individual to seek ways to express themselves, which is expression of I. So a hobby is basically an expression of I, not of me. So when in a UPSC interview you write about the hobbies, it is basically expression of I.